Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part two as we look at, some of these terms with ethics. And of course, we left off with these terms: moral nihilism, individual relativity, cultural relativity. Moral nihilism, teaching that there is really nothing that's ethical or moral. Individual relativity, holding that what, you might find to be ethical, I don't necessarily find to be ethical, and vice versa. And cultural relativity, holding that basically ethics will vary from culture to culture. But one thing that they all have in common is that they hold that there is not a universal moral code. So then, to continue on, have what's called soft universalism. Well, soft universalism holds that while there are universal moral truths, they cannot always be expressed. And then by contrast, you have ethical absolutism or hard universalism. Well, ethical absolutism or hard universalism argues that there are universal moral truths which must be followed regardless of the culture or the circumstance. Well, one thing that both soft universalism and ethical absolutism have in common is that they both argue that there is a universal moral truth. There is some type of right and wrong no matter where you are in the world. But how they function is different. Let me give a scenario that will explain both of them being used. A number of years ago, a woman arrived at a Catholic hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, with complications regarding her pregnancy. And the doctors at the hospital suggested that the best case scenario would be for the woman to have an abortion. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say that abortion is a universal moral wrong, just for the sake of argument. Now, as I mentioned, this is, or, was a Catholic hospital, and if you know anything about Catholic theology regarding abortion, abortion is pretty much forbidden almost in every circumstance you can imagine. The one exception would be if the situation fell into what is called the doctrine of double effect. That is the one exception, and chances are, if there were 10 scenarios, the chance that you might find a situation that fell into the doctrine of double effect might be 1 out of 10, and that would even be small. But regardless, okay, so with the scenario given, abortion, universal wrong for the sake of argument, well, on the ethics board was a sister, a nun, and she is hearing the arguments from the doctors that an abortion would be the best case scenario. The sister hears the arguments and she says, okay, while abortion is a universal wrong, this is a pretty unique circumstance. So, okay, I will give the approval to allow the abortion to take place because of the circumstances involved. Now, after this happened, word reached the bishop, who is the boss of the diocese. And the bishop calls up the sister and says, "What exactly did you do?" And the sister responds, Well, this woman came into the hospital with complications with her pregnancy. The doctors stated if an abortion did not take place, she would die, of course, along with the child. And after hearing the circumstances, I gave the approval that I thought the abortion was the best scenario to take place. To which the bishop responded, "Well, because of what you have done, you have automatically excommunicated yourself from the church." So, in the case of this situation, the sister, the nun, she would have been in the soft universalist camp that, okay, there are universal right and wrongs, but sometimes certain circumstances take place where they cannot always be expressed. The bishop, by contrast, he was in the ethical absolutist camp, that there are rights and wrongs and you follow them, regardless of the circumstance, culture, whatever, you follow them. Abortion is wrong, you don't practice it, it's not allowed, end of story. So, to continue on, have Ruth Benedict, an American anthropologist, when anthropology was in its infancy as a modern-day discipline. And I have down here below her portrait, ethics are culturally relative. So she's in the cultural relativist camp. And to help explain this, she gives some scenarios of tribal societies in her work Anthropology and the Abnormal. And I'm going to read a couple of them. Here's one from the primary source material found in the textbook. The most spectacular illustrations of the extent to which normality may be culturally defined are those cultures where an abnormality of our culture is the cornerstone of their social structure. It is not possible to do justice to these possibilities in a short discussion. A recent study of an island of northwest Malaysia by Fortune describes a society built upon traits which we regard as beyond the border of paranoia. In this tribe, the exogamic groups look upon each other as prime manipulators of black magic, so that one marries always into an enemy group which remains for life one's deadly and unappeasable foes. They look upon a good garden crop as a confession of theft, for everyone is engaged in making magic to induce into his garden the productiveness of his neighbors. Therefore, no secrecy in the island is so rigidly insisted upon as the secrecy of a man's harvesting of his yams. Their polite phrase at the acceptance of a gift is, "And if you now poison me, how shall I repay you this present?" Their preoccupation with poisoning is constant. No woman leaves her cooking pot for a moment unattended. Even the great affinio economic exchanges that are characteristic of this Malaysian culture area are quite altered in Dubois, since they are incompatible with this fear and distrust that pervades the culture. They go further and people the whole world outside of their own quarters with such malignant spirits that all-night feasts and ceremonials simply do not occur here. They have even rigorous religiously enforced customs that forbid the sharing of seed even in one family group. Anyone else's food is deadly poison to you, so that the commonality of stores is out of the question. For some months before harvest, the whole society is on the verge of starvation. But if one falls to the temptation, eats up one's seed yams, one is an outcast and a beachcomber for life. There is no coming back. It involves, as a matter of course, divorce and the breaking of all social ties. Now, in the society where no one may work with another, and no one may share with another, Fortune describes the individual who was regarded by all his fellows as crazy. He was not one of those who periodically ran amok, and beside himself and frothing at the mouth, fell with a knife upon anyone he could reach. Such behavior they did not regard as putting anyone outside the pale. But there was one man of sunny, kindly disposition who liked work and liked to be helpful. The compulsion was too strong for him to repress it in favor of the opposite tendencies of his culture. Men and women never spoke of him without laughing. He was silly and simple and definitely crazy. Nevertheless, to the ethnologist used to a culture that has, in Christianity, made his type the model of all virtue, he seemed a pleasant fellow. Okay. So, what is to be said there? Well, simply put, it's that ethics are going to vary from culture to culture. That this society, which is basically considered by us to be a extremely paranoid group, that's just their culture. That's just who they are. And they would find a culture like ours that's more sharing to be definitely beyond normal. And when Benedict, or Fortune more specifically, talks about this individual who, liked work, liked to be helpful, and so on and so forth, his culture thought this man was insane, that he was crazy. But as she puts it, in our culture, we would find him to be the model, you could say, of Christian virtue. So, in our culture, someone like this individual is accepted, but in his own culture, he's viewed as an outcast. But the point being that ethics will just vary from culture to culture, and it needs to be accepted. That there is no universal right and wrong in this sense. So, that's it that we have for these terms, and particularly with Ruth Benedict, a little bit of cultural relativity here. But is everyone on board with this argument? Well, no. As with all things in this class, no. And so, we will look later on at the argument against this particular notion that there is a universal moral truth. So, that will be for next time. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send me a message in the Q&A forum or send me an email. Till then, take care.